Hey everybody, how's it going? Well, you're probably wondering what I'm doing in a suit. Turns out I have some good news for you today. I got a real job. You see, YouTube really wasn't working out for me, so I went out and joined a private military group, also known as a PMC. They offer real money and health benefits, something YouTube doesn't do. This has been a long time coming, but I'm quitting YouTube. So I got a few things to get off my chest. Honestly, I think this platform is run by a bunch of monkeys. And my viewers, I'll be honest, I hate all of you. I hate you, and I really hate you. You're pretty cool though. As for the rest of you, I really don't care for any of you. This has been a long time coming. Finally, I'm gonna go out there and make some money. I wish I could stick around and answer all your questions, but I got a plane to catch. So goodbye, YouTube. It's been a pleasure.
3 years. 3 short years. And we've managed to create peace in my country. Of course, we couldn't have done it without you and your PMC group, Mr. Tobromancer.
Thank you, sir. Just doing our job.
I used to think private military groups like yours were just opportunistic, but I guess there's some good ones out there like yourself.
We prefer to call ourselves Private Protective Service.
What was that?
Stay in the car.
Hey baby! そんな不安定なところで戦う気か?
Hey you, anime boy. Get out of the road. This is official business.
やれるもんならやってみろ! ふざけんじゃねえ! すったことかい!
Looks like we got ourselves a weeb.
Go ahead, Mr. Juster. 早くしたまえ.
Oh, you think you're a samurai with your little red sword?
Oh shit.
Mr. President? Alright, tough guy. You wanna fight? Let's fight. Let's do it. Last samurai.
Don't fuck with me! I have the power of God and anime on my side!
Tobromancer, get me out of here.
Get back, Juster!
Mr. President! Alright, jackass. That's it. Oh, hey everybody. How's it going? Remember when I said I was gonna leave YouTube 3 years ago? It was a joke. I gotcha. I'm not going anywhere. So today's video is all about revenge. And what better way to get revenge than to make the sword from Metal Gear Rising that Raiden uses, his high frequency blade. Now it was very hard for me to find an image online because there's so many different variations on it, and I know he has a lot of different weapons, but I'm going to do his main one. So I found this picture online. I believe it's someone's selling this kind of sword that they do at cosplay knockoffs or something like that. But this is probably the best image I could find. And the good thing about this sword is, despite it looking pretty difficult, it was actually fairly easy to make. All you really need is a couple pieces of wood and some tools. So, without further ado, let's build Raiden's high frequency blade from the game Metal Gear Rising.
Alright, so here's a list of things you're going to need for this build. A sander and some sandpaper. I used two different kinds. One was more coarse and one was more soft. The P60 and the P50. But as long as one is soft and one is more rough, you should be fine. A Dremel and various Dremel bits. Now most of the time when you buy a Dremel, it comes with a pre-made kit for you. I basically use the two sander wheels. One's a little bit bigger and one's a bit smaller. The smaller one I use to get in there for those little tighter details. The bigger one is overall what I use the most. For certain parts you'll see that I needed to cut long pieces of wood, and the saw blade was perfect for getting it done. You'll also see a brief appearance by my electric saw, but if you have a saw blade, you really don't need to use this. I just did for practicality. Some tape and glue. The glue was really key for gluing everything together. It's again my famous dollar store glue. The tape, I just used various types of tape to keep things in place while I was measuring them out. Any kind of tape will do. Spray paint, I used gray, metallic, and black. The gray is a primer that I didn't have, and I ended up using white, but later on realized how much I prefer the gray one. Halfway through filming, I went out and I bought some, and at least in my opinion, it was the right move. Wood filler. This stuff is absolutely amazing. You'll see in the project I kind of messed up, and this stuff filled it out as if it was never there. Some hand paint and Q-tips. I just used white and black. You'll see at the end of the video why, along with Q-tips, which you can find practically anywhere, probably in your house. No need for a paintbrush this time. A pen, Sharpie, and ruler. The ruler for measuring things out accordingly. The pen and Sharpie are for tracing, so you know where to cut. Safety gear. Glasses and a mask. Seriously guys, for this build, you need to wear a mask and some sort of protective eyewear. I don't know what it was with the wood, but the sawdust absolutely went everywhere. And you really don't want to have to breathe this stuff in. And of course, a piece of wood. If you remember a while back, I built that Aloha Oi sign from pieces of wood and fence I found along the beach. Well, I had one good one left. Of course you can go to any hardware store and just buy one for around $5 or so, but I had a spare. You'll actually need one really tall one, or one good sized one, and some extra pieces. I had my one lying around, and a few short pieces that I couldn't use for anything else, so they came out perfectly here. This one was right about the right size. It may have been a bit short, but it's all I had to work with. Alright, first thing we're going to do is sand it all down. Because it's an old piece of wood that was just lying around, it has a lot of grooves and imperfections. Just sand it down as best you can, trying to get rid of all those grooves. Once that's done, go ahead and dry out the edge of the blade. Now you can do that with your Dremel, but again, I had my saw blade, so I just went ahead and cut it off there. Now if you look at the sword itself, there's a little arch at the bottom near the hilt. You don't want to make it too deep, so don't put too much pressure on it. Just eat away at it slowly. I go along the top of the sword, trying to get a bit of an edge like the samurai sword would have. For the most part, I can't do too much, otherwise the blade will become too thin. It's coming out looking pretty good. Not a bad shape to it. So right on the edge of the hilt, it's a little oval. So I just take my sander and just sand it down ever so gently to give it a slightly round shape. Now, using that second piece of wood I mentioned, this one is really malformed, and I can't use it for anything else, so it's perfect for what I'm doing here. Again, sand it down to get rid of all those grooves. This part is going to be used for the hilt, so I cut it in half, according to how long I want the hilt to be. So looking at them, they measure out just right for the hilt. Now to make sure all the wood aligned, I sanded it down so that everything was flush, which means everything is the equal size. Now the grip on the hilt is really different. It seems to be cut in half with all these intricate little holes in between. So I go ahead and line it up, measuring it in half right down the middle. I do this for both pieces of wood, Then using the makeshift measuring thing I have for the saw blade, I go along and cut it perfectly in half, right down the middle. When you're done, it comes out looking like this. Now I tape it up and trace out where it's going to be on the blade, along with any details I want for the hilt itself. Now while I found it hard to find a good picture of the hilt, I did have that one I showed you earlier. Now because of all the little holes and details that are in the center of the hilt, I go along both sides, and on even sides of the halfway point, I leave a little space. In there is where I'm going to put the crisscross lines. Well, I call it crisscross lines. They're really holes, but because I was eyeballing it, I just drew X's along there and then covered in the parts that I would cut out. I just looked at the image I had and got a feel for where all the holes are going to be. Then using a Sharpie, I go over the lines to make them more visible. So all in all, it looks something like this. Once you're fairly confident, go ahead and use your Dremel and begin sanding out the details. Once that's done, you can cut off the tape and begin sanding away at the interior of the hilt. This is a very risky part, so just go softly on it. You don't want to have to do this cut again, especially if you have limited wood like I do. This was a long and tedious process, especially with me having to angle it in front of a camera instead of looking at it directly. If you decide to do it, it should be a lot easier. Again, just watch your fingers. And this is why we need safety gear, because I accidentally cut myself while working on it, but at least now I can say I actually put blood, sweat, and tears into my work. Once you've done the one side, you can see how it came out. Now instead of tracing the other side like I did with this, I just decided to tape this up and spray it once over with black spray paint. This way, when I cut it open, I already have the trace marks there for me. Now again, go at it gently with the Dremel. This really is the longest and toughest part of the build, but once you finish this part, you're over the hill. Plus, once you're done, you get to admire it for a second, before going on to the next part. Now if you look at the image of the sword, there's this little tip that comes out right between where the blade and hilt meet. My piece of wood wasn't big enough for that, so I just had to add it on using another piece of scrap wood. It's really just for this small little thing, but details are everything. Be careful when sanding it because it is so small, not to snip your finger. All that for this little guy. I then take some glue and stick it on. Now for the dollar store glue, this is some of the best glue I've ever seen. It dries super fast and is very effective. You can leave it on there for about 10 seconds and it should stick. To be safe, hold on to it for about 30 seconds. Now because there's another piece of the black hilt along the arch, I'm just going to put a piece of wood underneath it and trace out the shape of the blade. That way I have the exact arch of the sword itself, and I can continue designing it. Using my saw blade, I'm going to go ahead and chop it out. And great, I messed it up. But that's alright because that's what the wood filler's for. Finally I get it out. That little scratch is directly on a piece that I need, but I'm just going to sand out the shape first. Making sure everything aligns, I then use another piece of wood on top of the black hilt part with everything aligned perfectly. That way I can trace out where the short piece ends and the long one begins. So when I go to stick it on, everything is measured up and the pieces aren't overlapping. And of course everyone's favorite part, make sure you do it twice. I then take some of the wood and trace out this small little guy onto another piece. But you guys already know the process, so here's the second piece. Now with that out of the way, there's one more piece, the third and final part. Go ahead and design it accordingly. You can't see it, but I have the picture in front of me while I'm doing this whole project. Once it's done, cut it out twice. Of course, the wood wasn't tall enough for the tip, so I had to glue that on as well. But hey, when you put them side by side, everything aligns up. It's a tight fit, but that's exactly what I want. Now to fix up that little piece, I'm going to take a little wood filler and just seal up that little gash. Heck, for any imperfections, I might as well just put wood filler on all of it. You don't think you need it, but you can actually go through quite a bit of wood filler. Once it dries, you can start sanding it down. I use the smoother sandpaper for this one, because I'm just trying to get it flat. I don't want to dig too deep into the wood. This stuff more or less sands pretty easy, but the smaller parts are a little trickier, given their size. Now to make the sharp edges, I just take a pen and ruler and measure out how thick I want the sharp part to be. Raiden's katana is sharp on both sides, so I did the front and back of the blade. Using my Dremel, I just slowly sand down along the blade, making sure I don't cross the pen line that I've made. You can't really see it, but it is starting to show some progress. After you do with the Dremel, I just sand it down to make it smooth. Of course, I couldn't get the shot with me hunched over trying to sand it down, so now you have to look at me in all my misery. Now the hilts are still square, so using a soft piece of sandpaper, I just gently, by hand, smooth out the edges where I'll be gripping the sword. You can leave it as is, but this definitely improves the feel when holding it. Now I put everything down and give it a coat of black spray paint. Make sure you go around to every angle, that way no part of it remains unpainted. Now with everything in place, you have a sword that looks something like this. Now I notice on the blade there's this little hole, and it's really not necessary to do it, but I decided to go with it anyway. My Dremel came with a little bit that's like a drill, so using a piece of wood, I clamped it down and just went directly into the wood, making a little hole right at the end of the hilt. And when you pull it out, you got yourself a perfect little hole. Now I want to put a few layers of primer on the sword before I start painting it, but this is before I got my gray. I had a can of white spray paint that claimed to be primer, but it just wasn't as good. I even later went ahead and spray painted it silver, just to see what it would look like if I decided to stop there. As you can tell, all the grooves are still very visible. So, given that I had two different kinds of sandpaper, I decided to go with the softer one, and just sand it down a bit more. Given that there's a layer of paint and primer on there, the paint that's in the grooves should remain there, thus filling it out a bit more, while the sander on top flattens the grooves. Also, while no one was watching, I went out and bought the gray primer, and did a layer on everything, including the hilt bits. Once they dried, I went over them again with the black spray paint. I should mention that I use flat black spray paint. Most of the time you can buy gloss, but I always choose flat, because it doesn't leave that shine. Now with everything coming together, this is what all the pieces look like. If you had asked me now, I don't know why I went over and spray painted it black. Probably just to buff out the grooves a bit more. I then go over it again with my gray primer spray paint to try to get rid of the grooves as much as possible. Then once dried, a nice coat of silver spray paint. Again, I went around the entire sword and sprayed it from all angles, making sure I got every nook and cranny. I let that sit and dry, because once it's good and ready to go, I take it inside. If you look at the Raiden blade, there seems to be some sort of nails that go along the blade and hilt itself, and I was already too far along in the project to start nailing stuff in. In a last minute attempt, I came up with this idea to combine black and white brush paint, mixing it together to make a gray. Then using a Q-tip, I dabbed the tip of the Q-tip into the paint and popped little dots on everywhere that I thought there should be a nail. That goes for both sides of the blade as well. On the camera in certain light you can't see it, but up close it definitely shows itself. Now we're at that point where I start gluing everything on. Using my dollar store super glue, I dab along the interior and very carefully place it on the blade. You really only get one shot at this, so make sure you're patient. I then flip it over and do it to the reverse side as well. And well, now that everything's in place, let's see how it came out.
Alright everybody, so that was the video. The sword ended up coming out really nice. I'd like to say better than expected, but I always expect better than what I produce. It really wasn't that difficult of a build. You know, the Dremel really did most of the work for me. And I gotta say, this is probably one of the lightest swords I've ever made. Honestly, like, it was just like a couple pieces of wood, and there's really not too much more to say about it. It's really amazing what you can do with a piece of wood. But anyway, if you like this video and you want to see me do more, comment down below and let me know what you'd like to see me do next. You know, in terms of swords and stuff like that, I'm getting pretty good at them, so if you have any suggestions, honestly, just leave them down below. Now, most of you guys just think this is a regular prop sword, but for me, it's a tool for justice. So if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go get some revengeance. Revengeance. Why do they call it that in the first place? I'm so glad they changed it to Rising. This is a tool for justice, and I'm gonna get some revenge. I'll see you later.
Rules of nature!
Hey, jackass! Time for a little revengeance. Revenge. I'm here for revenge.
てめえ、ずいぶん好き放題コケにしてくれたじゃねえか。
Round 2.
Nah, I'm just kidding. I wouldn't leave you hanging like that. I kicked his ass. But if you like this video and you'd like to see me do more, comment down below and let me know what you'd like to see me do next. Otherwise, I will see you on the next one.
やめてください。